All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield from Crimson Cast here today, part of the Back Home Network. We're scheduled to start here in a couple of minutes, but we wanted to go ahead and get the live stream up and running so that people had a chance to tune in for the beginning. And I believe we are rolling now. As we go along here, we are doing an emergency podcast to talk about the news of the death of former Indiana head basketball coach Bob Knight, who passed away, we believe, today at the age of 83. For those who know Coach Knight's situation, he'd been battling some pretty severe maladies here over the course of the last couple of years. And while the news is not shocking, it's certainly shocking from the standpoint that it's the passing of an absolute icon. And, I think if any listing of the most well-known people in the history of Indiana University or connection with Indiana University, probably in the top 3 or 4, and maybe the most well-known person ever associated with the university, at least on a national scale. Scott, a little bit about the circumstances of Coach Knight's passing. We don't know most of the details, obviously, and that's not really why we're doing the show. We wanted to try to talk through what people are feeling and experiencing right now, as this was someone that you and I took a class from late in his time at Indiana. It's someone that as fans, we grew up watching, not just his teams, but him. And for a lot of the IU fan base, this was the prism through which Indiana basketball was viewed. Indiana basketball certainly has a tremendously long and storied history, but for our generation, both Scott and I are in our 40s. For the generation that came before us, certainly Bob Knight was synonymous with Indiana University, was synonymous with the type of basketball that people still associate with the university, and certainly brought some of the most successful and high-profile moments to Indiana University of anybody in the sports realm. And this is a relationship between Knight and Indiana fans that certainly had its ups and downs over the last 20 or so years. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But Knight and IU being able to reconcile towards the tail end of things, I think one of the big concerns people always had was, what if Coach Knight had passed before all of that ever occurred? The fact that Knight was fully back within the IU family, was at practices regularly, had been fully embraced by Coach Mike Woodson and his staff and the players, was, really kind of it was a happy ending to a story that had certainly not looked like it was headed towards a happy ending over the course of time. Your thoughts, I guess, first and foremost. This news only broke about an hour and a half ago. I think we're both kind of still digesting it to some degree. But what were your initial thoughts when you heard the news?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to say with what you were talking about is I would even take a step back and take the university part out of it. And one of the most well-known people just in Indiana, we'll talk about this a little more. I'm a year older than you, different generation. No, but growing up, I moved from New York to Bloomington in 1985. And so I grew up in Bloomington in the epicenter of, the height of Bob Knight. And, when we would travel around to different parts of the country, we'd even travel to Europe. You would say, where are you from? I'm from Indiana. It would be like, oh, Bob Knight. And like, literally, I heard that multiple times. So, you are right about Indiana University, but it's also just Indiana for, I've written down some stories here, just for Indiana. He was such a large figure. And I think everybody, probably under 30 or 35, I don't want to sound like the old guy, but it's just, you have no idea how big of a figure he was, not just the university, in the state. Just he was synonymous with Indiana. When you ask my first thoughts, I was thinking of that on the drive. I was just actually in Bloomington today, driving home. You and I have been friends for years, and don't want to, not trying to get too personal here, but it is, kind of a different podcast. Honestly, the first thought was, we've both lost parents, and my first thought went to Pat Knight. There was the video that just came out with the IU media department of Pat Knight kind of telling some Bob Knight stories. So it's fresh on my mind. But we'll definitely talk about Bob Knight the majority of this. But just to be totally honest, like losing a parent is unmooring. It can be a shock, and so my heart goes out to the entire family. But I just think of, Pat Knight was a little bit older than me. I remember going to see him in games. We remember seeing him play. And so just, I know everyone's heart goes out. I just wanted to say that, having been there, I just think of Pat. That was, that honestly was my first thought.
Yeah, it's certainly very sad, and obviously his son Tim as well, who was a bit older. I mean, it's
not to leave him.
No, absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting because it's hard to really reconcile the position that Bob Knight occupied in the culture of the state of Indiana, as you mentioned, of Indiana University basketball, and really just the way in which Knight carried himself and the kind of connection between his teams and the fans that he was essentially the arbiter of. He was the person that helped to channel that. And Knight, I talk about Knight in the class that I teach every semester, and it's part of a larger history of Indiana basketball. And I always say, and this is not meant to offend anybody, but Indiana basketball and the place that Indiana basketball holds in the hearts and minds of so many people that grew up in Indiana, went to Indiana University, it's almost like a religion in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that from a worship perspective, but I mean that from a cultural perspective. It's like you're part of a secular church. And Bob Knight was essentially almost a papal figure within that church. He was the leader of not just a basketball program, but he was essentially what a lot of people looked up to in terms of, this is part of your childhood, this is part of your adulthood, this is part of what you are wrapped up in emotionally and mentally and intellectually. And the amount of time and effort people have gone to over the course of time, especially over the last 40, 50 years, going to Indiana basketball games, organizing their entire vacation, or their work schedule or their recreational schedule around when Indiana basketball games were on. I mean, that's gone on to some degree for a long time. But from the time that Knight took over as head coach, really through the time that he was fired as head coach, that 29-year period, Indiana basketball was such a huge part of so many people's lives. And Knight was the seminal figure in all of that. He was the constant. And even no longer at Indiana, he cast such a tremendous shadow over the basketball program and never really left the minds and thoughts of the people who followed IU basketball. And, I think that's a fascinating spot to be in as a public figure, as somebody who coaches a basketball program. And I don't know that there would ever have been quite the same level of connection between a fan base and a basketball coach the way that there was between Bob Knight and Indiana. And it's very similar to, how you'll read about, Bear Bryant and the Alabama fan base, or, there's other coaches that you could mention that fall into that category. But Knight was Indiana's coach. Yep. And he was as much the state of Indiana's coach as he was Indiana University's coach. And it's been, really fascinating as someone who grew up in a household where literally like everything revolved around Indiana basketball from October until March. My fandom came through my father, and my father wasn't an Indiana native. He moved to Bloomington in 1964. He started going to Indiana games at the New Field House. His first favorite player was Vern Payne, who, that was well before IU hired Bob Knight. But Knight inspired a fervor and a passion in so many IU fans that, you almost have to have grown up around people like that, or have grown up in a household where somebody felt that way to really understand what it was like. And it's almost impossible to put into words, Scott. And I'm, a lot of these emotions and a lot of these feelings, I'm kind of numb right now because a lot of my younger days and the relationship I had with my own dad and the way that interacted with IU basketball, we're all tied in with Bob Knight and with Bob Knight's particular way, not just of coaching, but the way that he inspired people to believe every time Indiana took the floor that they were going to find a way to win. And the immense amount of pride and passion that helped to generate in a state that frankly didn't have a whole lot else going for it, it felt like, for large stretches of that time period. I mean, Indiana basketball under Bob Knight was essentially the professional sport of the state of Indiana. It was that or Notre Dame football. It wasn't the Colts, who weren't even here until halfway through Knight's tenure, essentially. It wasn't the Pacers, who were very much a peripheral team until very late in Knight's tenure. It was Knight, and it was IU basketball. And it wasn't just Knight coaching, but it was Knight's presence. It was his words. It was the way that he described a world that people liked and wanted to gravitate towards. It was a world of order. It was a world of discipline. And it was ironic because many of those things were not actually how Knight himself conducted himself. And I think being an IU fan during that period, you kind of got used to that dichotomy, and it didn't bother you nearly as much as it bothered or seemed to bother people who weren't IU fans or people who were from outside the state, which I think may be why it's so hard to describe exactly the mix of emotions with this news. Because it's been a long time since that was the way that it was, but it's still fascinating, like how real that feeling is and how much Bob Knight represented a particular period of time within not just Indiana University history, but really the history of basketball within the state.
He was such a larger than life figure. And you said something about like how he was ours, that he was our Bear Bryant, but it during that time, it felt like the epicenter of college basketball was around Bob Knight, and not, like you said, there was so much more to him than just being a great coach, which I want to dig into, that he almost doesn't get enough credit for as great of a coach as he was. But, it wasn't just that. There was all of, I don't want to say antics, but it was just his persona. But what was also so unique about it was he was beloved by everybody in college basketball. Like, John Thompson would always love Bob Knight. And, even the refs would glowingly tell Bob Knight stories, and other coaches would tell Knight stories. And, my most interesting stat is the winningest coach in the Big Ten in the 80s is Lou Henson, not Knight, not Gene Cady. But it's but Knight was the orbit that the Big Ten revolved around. And up until the mid 90s, it felt like he was the orbit that college basketball revolved around, and every coach he went against, loved him and was hugged. It felt like he was just, it was so cool because he was ours, and it felt like everything revolved around us. And Hoosiers comes out, and it doesn't have to do with Knight, but it's they're doing things that, there's definitely a Knight vibe in Hoosiers. Not that Blue Chips is even close to the same, but it's Nick Nolte going to.
They went and studied Bob Knight.
They studied Bob Knight. And it's I wonder who the Emmett Scott or whoever the booster was who he studied, but different story for a different pod. But even the thing is while this is sad, it is. It's there is also a humor part. I sit down with my wife we had a really quick dinner. My wife, who, we were at the game, the Ted Valentine game together. It was one of our first, fourth or fifth dates. We went to the Ted Valentine game, which we can talk about. That was a wild experience. So, and one of my favorite April Fool's jokes with my wife for a couple of years was, they fired Bob Knight, and then it became a reality. But, she even said, well, are they going to bury him upside down? Because if you don't know, and I'm not being flippant, one of his favorite speeches, which if you haven't seen it, you will see it, I'm sure. Yeah. And I think it was actually Pat Knight's senior day was, when my time on earth is done.
It was the previous year.
Yeah. When my time on earth is done, and my critics here,
my memories here are past. I want to bury me upside down,
so my critics can kiss my ass. And it's they're going to play that now, but it's there's humor with Knight too, where. Anyway, I'm with you. It's so conflicted, and it does bring me back to it's very visceral, that moment of I started going to games with my dad, and my dad was not a native Hoosier. He grew up in, California, and then we were in New York, and we come here. But as a young young boy in Bloomington, it's like that's the ideal, and like that's how you play. And you heard stories about the Bob Knight basketball camp, and it was like with a little bit of terror, with a little bit of fun, but it's like it was the way, and like that's how you build men. It's yeah. There's a lot of emotions. Yeah,
it is. No, and I mean, we're getting some great comments from the folks that are joining us here live, and we really appreciate it. I mean, that note there from Brian Tonsoni, I think a lot of boys and girls growing up in Indiana in the 70s and 80s. I mean, it was a similar kind of thing. It wasn't everybody, and I think what's important to remember is that IU basketball wasn't a monoculture. There were people when we were in school and before that who didn't like Bob Knight, who felt like the game had passed him by, or that he was, not right for Indiana. And look, I mean, there were a lot of things that, every tribute you're going to read about Bob Knight is going to say he was a flawed man, but he was a genius. And that's most geniuses, is that they are generally very flawed people in one way or another. I think what made Knight so fascinating as a person was he was such an intelligent person. He was such a well-read individual. I mean, any profile you watched of Knight, any profile you read of Bob Knight, it talks so in depth about how familiar he is with these different aspects of literature and history, and he was such a huge student of the Civil War and of World War II, and
Patton, big fan of Patton. Yeah,
you and I, the class that we took with Knight in I guess it would have been the fall of '99.
Yep.
He only really taught 3 of the lectures. It was an 8-week class.
Yeah, we took a class with Norm Ellenberger. Substitute taught by Bob Knight.
Yes. Some guest appearances, but they were great because you'd walk in, and I mean, it was like, you're a 19, 20-year-old kid. You're sitting in a desk in the IU press room, and Bob Knight comes strolling in. And he told everybody, go buy The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which is not what you weren't getting that in most of your other classes on campus at that point, at least not the ones that we were taking majors for. But he was an intellectual who had decided to devote his life to understanding and teaching the game of basketball. He was insanely successful. I was trying to describe this to my class the other day. I mean, this is a guy who was so successful that in his first year, he took a team that hadn't been to a postseason in 5 years to the NIT. And then in his second year, he won a Big Ten title and went to the Final Four. In his third year, he won a co-championship in the Big Ten, didn't go to the NCAA, but instead went to a different tournament that they created and won that. Third year, went undefeated in the regular season, won a Big Ten title, and lost in the regional final to Kentucky. And in his fourth year, went undefeated, won a Big Ten title, and won the national championship. I mean, 4 Big Ten titles in his first 5 seasons, and playing a style that would become one of the primary dominant ways of playing basketball at the college level for the next 15 years. And doing so with a talented team, but not the type of talent that you normally won that level of games with. And, so much of what he did was based around relatively simple principles that were executed flawlessly because he was so good at preparing his teams to do what they needed to do on a night in, night out basis. And that kind of a start to a career, sometimes that's your pinnacle. And we see so many coaches, they hit that and they drift off. Instead, Knight wins another title 5 years later. He wins another title 6 years after that. He makes another Final Four 5 years after that. He won so many games. He won, 73% of the games that he coached at IU, which is bizarre, like how hard that is to do. And, it's funny, like you and I obviously were at IU at the tail end of his time, and people were complaining about how mediocre IU was. And then you look back and it's like with imperfect teams, and he was certainly as much to blame for that as anybody in terms of the recruiting at the time. He was regularly getting single-digit seeds and winning 20 games in the regular season. It's like that was the low point for the most part. It's like the basketball side of things it was such an era of success. You mentioned IU being the epicenter of basketball. And I tell people, younger students, now that I work with, it's like how people think today of North Carolina, or maybe North Carolina is a bad example, but Duke, Kentucky, Kansas, like that echelon of teams. That was what Indiana was from basically 1972 to 1993, a 20-year period of time where Indiana was the preeminent program in college basketball. And it was Bob Knight. I mean, those were heights that Indiana hadn't hit in 15 years prior. Knight took over a program that was lost, had losing seasons, had player revolt the year before that he took over, was a program that had been stuck in the mud for a variety of reasons. And he harnessed it and turned it into a basketball superpower and gave IU fans something to celebrate and not just be proud of, but feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves for the longest period of time. Those were just a fascinating period of time in college basketball, and it really reestablished Indiana as one of the top programs in the country.
You mentioned his early start in Indiana. I just want to highlight that, and then just two other coaching things is, yes, I mean, by 76, they were 32-0. He was... 76. Knight was 36 at that point. So at the age of 36, he had a 2-year run of going 63-1 and had a undefeated and a title. But you even go before that, he took over Army at 25 years old. And I don't have the, Ken Palm doesn't go back that far, so I don't know Army stats, but he's 18-8 his first year. He's at Army for 6 years. Before he's 30, he's 102-50 at Army, which, I don't know their Ken Palm, who they were playing, but it's like, that's a great record. He did all of this, like you said, had a pinnacle of a career by the time he was 36. I mean, you talk about like wonderkins, and it's like, oh, like this guy's a young coach. Like, he's 25, just straight to head coaching, straight to success, had, 5 straight winning seasons at Army. I was also thinking about this with Knight, just the legacy is that, I've heard this talked about with Tom Brady, for example, is like, he has a cup, Brady's got a lot of Super Bowls, but you could say like he was unlucky in a couple, he was lucky in a couple, like this is probably the right number. The thing with Knight is the 76 title, that's not like that was a title. The 81 title, that was a title. You could maybe say that 87, like, okay, that's a key smart shot. Like that's a toss up. So he's 2 for 3. But you look at 70, like he's honestly, for as good of a career as he had, was actually pretty unlucky because outside of a Scott May injury, they're probably 63 or 63-0, or they go 2 straight seasons back to back undefeated. He has another title in 75. We all, I don't just automatically give him the 93 title with Allen Henderson's injury, but that's a very bad injury to a team that had higher aspirations. There's also, I don't want to dig too much into this, but it's like there's a world where if Knight's able to keep it together, he takes that 2002 team that Mike Davis took to the final game. Maybe he has a title there. There's what I'm getting at is like you can see with a little bit of injury luck, Knight could have 5-6 titles and just things playing out right. But it's like you can't also say like, oh, he would have lost them. Like the 76 and 81 ones were just hardcore straight titles. Well,
and it's interesting. There was a comment from Gary Parrish of all people. I was watching some of the tributes in various places, and Parrish was like, there's a real argument he was the greatest head coach of all time, and that's not controversial to IU fans,
right?
Who I think already think that Knight is the greatest coach of all time. But it's interesting watching some of the reaction from across the country because, almost all of the reaction has been, well, not only did Knight win at this insanely high level, but he never cheated. He had great disdain for the NCAA, but he obeyed the rules to the letter because that's how he was as a person. I've always felt to some degree, there's that quote that has been repeated a few times today where, he said something along the lines of the joy is not in cheating to get great players. It's in beating the teams that cheated to get great players. Knight, you mentioned that amazing streak that he rattled off by the age of 36. And I almost want, there's a part in Season on the Brink where you read where he almost walks away from coaching after winning the NCAA title in 81.
Yeah.
Because in his mind, at that point, he's 40 years old.
What's there left to do?
What else is he going to do? Because at that point, he didn't think he was going to be the Olympic head coach because he had been passed over for the 1980 role, which actually ended up going in his favor because the U.S. didn't play in those Olympics. And it's what I think is fascinating about Knight as a figure. When you try to apply straight up logic, it doesn't always work because Knight was motivated by things that I think are hard for the average person to understand. Knight didn't go on coaching to set the record for the most wins in NCAA history, even though he did. He didn't go on coaching after that 81 season to win another title. He goes on coaching because while he's trying to sort his future out, Landon Turner gets into an accident driving to Kings Island and breaks his neck and becomes a paraplegic. And Knight, and again, this is from Season on the Brink, but Knight at that point realizes he can't leave. Like he's got an emotional and he's got a responsibility, I guess, for lack of a better term. And that it's fascinating because
just real quick, and also part of the aura of Knight is like he gets Landon Turner drafted by the Celtics.
Right. Well, and this becomes part of the very complicated legacy of Bob Knight.
Yeah.
You cannot, none of these obituaries or anything that are coming out will really be able to fully capture the essence of Bob Knight because you can't. It's a larger than life. It's like trying to write a single book about Teddy Roosevelt. Like it's such a multifaceted life.
It's a good call.
It makes no sense if you put it down on paper.
Yeah.
And with Knight, it's a little more, Knight wasn't president. It's a lot more constrained.
No, he's papal. You already said he's Pope.
Right. But it's fascinating because here's a guy for whom on the one hand, it's a constant stream of, well, look, he acted like a jerk here, or he had these publicized incidents that were really negative. But then on the flip side, he's behind the scenes very quietly. He's raising, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get Landon Turner's family a van and an equipped wheelchair so that he can move around. He's putting, bringing Turner in and putting him at the end of the scorer's table and letting him watch games there. And he would do things and would focus himself on doing things that really did make a tremendous difference in people's lives. And he didn't publicize those things. Now, others did publicize them for him, because you would hear about these, he would go and he would raise tons of money for the library. He would go and visit, kids in hospitals and wouldn't want anybody to know that he was there. Now, you knew about it because you heard about it enough, but it was hard to reconcile for people who wanted to paint him as simply a bully or simply somebody who was out of control all the time. And it's why I think there's so many varied ideas about Bob Knight as a person. You had players who couldn't stand him, and would leave the program. You had players who would probably literally throw themselves in front of a bus for the guy. He inspired such a tremendous range of emotion and an intellectual response in so many people. And it inspired, I think, in the people that were fans of Knight, were fans of Indiana basketball because of Knight. It inspired this almost unceasing loyalty that you still see today. I mean, we're here on a Wednesday night at 8:40. There's 235 people live watching this, and these testimonials and little comments are coming in on YouTube and they're pouring in. And I know there's thousands of people who feel the same way, who are expressing these things. I've gotten 25 text messages from friends, former students, people that know that, I'm obviously a Knight fan and an IU fan, just wanting to talk about it. And, the fact that that's happening, I think just kind of illustrates how much Knight meant to so many people, how much of people's lives during this period from the early mid 70s all the way up to the present day got intertwined with Knight and the prism of Knight as basketball fed through it. It's a really fascinating phenomenon, and it's something that just not that many people really are able to inspire. And Knight was one of those folks that were really just, capable of doing that almost effortlessly. And it's really interesting to kind of watch all of this interaction take place right now.
Well, you mentioned that dichotomy, and this was a story. I mean, it's almost become like a tall tale now. I'm not even sure how much of it is real, but I remember before, when I was either in high school or middle school, like the story was at one of like the freshman assemblies for IU, Knight got on a kid for being out of shape. And it's like, that's all that kind of run with. But then like you later learn that like he ended up pulling the kid aside, talking to him, and then he let him work out with the team and the kid dropped, 60 pounds. But it's like these stories, like you said, like there's two sides to it. There's kind of the public facing and then what Knight actually did. But then it also just becomes like this Paul Bunyan type tale where it's just like this story. The thing that, the other piece, we're kind of all over the map here. The other piece you mentioned, we were in the class together, and I want to get to some of those stories. But we both had the privilege of getting to cover Bob Knight in a way as student journalists. But the other piece of Knight that is hard to capture, that we were there for, and kind of with the tail end, but he was very imposing. Like in that class, he is a legit 6'7", 6'8". At that time, he was, not skinny. He was, 250. And I remember in the class, it's like, my God, it's like, he's just imposing. And like, I do remember he left the class and we would always go and like do, stuff on the court. He came back to say something and I was in the back row and he just put his hand on my shoulder, just using me as like a steady. And it's like, holy shit, like that's Bob Knight's hand. It's like, but he's just, and I remember thinking like, just don't burp, don't fart, like just don't do anything to draw attention to yourself. But I think that sometimes gets lost too, when you just realize like when he went after somebody, it was not scary, but it was like he definitely demanded attention. But as you said, like just this dichotomy of like he could get angry, he could get mad, but he also, I mean, in a way, he almost missed his time because he was so memeable and his quotes were just so funny and so on the nose. And, he just had so many one-liners. We're both Indiana fans. We saw all the press conferences. There really is nobody out there like that today who has the kind of quips and jokes and comebacks. And, he's like, I think, just so many, the interview with Jeremy Schaap where he's, just like little jabs, like, you're not as good as your dad. And it's like, he's just like rant. It's so much in one package, as you say.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting in a lot of ways because ultimately I think a lot about the way that it ended here at IU. And I think a lot about how it kind of forever changed the frame that Bob Knight will get viewed through for some fans. And it also essentially created a fracture in the way that the fan base worked for a long time. It still is there to a large degree. I mean, it still hasn't healed. And it was there before Knight got fired. I remember on the early days of the message boards, those who were on like the Independent Indiana Basketball Forum or the very early stages of Peegs.com, there were the moles and the lemmings, and the moles were the folks that didn't like Knight, and the lemmings were the people that loved Knight. And, and it was that was even happening then. That was 1996, 1997. And, it's interesting as someone who certainly felt like there was fault on both sides in terms of the Knight IU relationship. It just is a shame that it created such a rift between people, between groups in the fan base, between Knight and the university. And, Knight, as you mentioned, he was a tremendously clever guy. He was very good at getting the last word in, even if it left a bad taste in your mouth. And I think, for a lot of people, they became acculturated to looking at Knight as an enemy of IU because he certainly didn't have anything nice to say about IU for the longest time. And the feeling was kind of mutual there for about 6 or 7 years, which a lot of times gets left out of the equation. I think IU did a lot to try to bring Knight back into the fold, starting with 2010, 2011, and Knight wasn't ready. And, when he finally was ready, it was late. Fortunately, it wasn't too late, but it was one of those things where you would have loved to have had him around as a fully embraced elder statesman for a lot longer within the program.
Yeah, he's like what Katie has at Purdue. It's like there's a part of me, it's like that. It sucks we didn't get that.
Yeah, but I'd also, I think, given Knight's personality and given the way it just wasn't in the cards, and look, I think that I love the fact that somehow, and I think Mike Woodson deserves a huge amount of credit for this. And I think that Scott Dolson deserves a huge amount of credit for this. And I think Fred Glass, made a lot of efforts to try to make things happen as well. I mean, for all of this to come together in the way that it did, and at least allow Knight to get publicly recognized at an IU game.
Yep.
The way that it happened with his former players at his side, the number of people that were at that game who still talk about how emotional of a moment that was. Matt Cohen, former student journalist who's covering Auburn right now, talked about like that feeling in that arena was hard to even find an analog for within the history of IU and certainly within what we normally see in college basketball. And I'm glad that moment happened. I remember, there was a live podcast at the Bluebird back in 2019.
Yep.
That was the first time I met Knight since I was in class with you. And I remember I sat with him in the green room for a while and we, chatted a little bit. And that was really a special moment for me. And it was just fascinating, even at that age, the gravity, as difficult as it was for him to move at that point, the gravity with which you felt around Bob Knight. It was just kind of almost a supernatural force. And that's what's been on my mind here the most recently, is that as deteriorating as his health had been over the course of the last few years, I'm glad that moment at least happened. And as much for everybody else around Knight as for Knight himself, that occurred. And I'm really fascinated to see, how people's remembrances are as they move forward here over the next couple of days. We're already starting to see some pop up. I mean, the Dan Wetzel piece is actually really well done. I haven't had a chance to read a whole lot of other ones, but I would really encourage, especially our younger audience, talk to the people who were around when Knight was there. Go back and watch some of those games that are up on the YouTube channel. You're never going to get the full, experience of what it was like during that period. But I'm glad that, there's some connections still back to that people can look at and talk with people about. And it's really, as you mentioned, it's so multifaceted. It's the humor and the cynicism and the sarcasm and the funny comments, as much as it is the tremendous X's and O's, the tremendous amount of coaches across the spectrum that respected the man and that studied from the man. And it was, we were doing a segment on IU women's basketball, the first full-time women's basketball coach, B. Gorton, who took her team to the Final Four. Like people would think, Knight, misogynist, wouldn't ever have women in his practice. She was at his practices all the time, learning from him. Pat Summitt would come and watch practices all the time. He had a tremendous respect for people that he respected in their professions, for coaches, and even for media. I mean, as much as people talk about how the media did Knight dirty, some did. Certainly there were a lot of reporters and columnists who either didn't like Knight, and I'm not saying they were wrong in not liking Knight, but knew that Knight was a reliable piñata for them to whack on, because it's easy to punch up with a lot of these things. But Knight had great friends in the media. He had friendships with a lot of the top writers. He had friendships with people who were top-notch broadcasters. And it's just kind of interesting, even in that population, and a lot of times you get journalists who, they'll tend to, they all concentrate on kind of similar things. You see similar themes. There were huge disagreements among those people about how they felt about Bob Knight and how they interacted with him. But the one thing that you'll notice is the people that generally like spent time with Knight and worked with him tended to be fans of his after a while. And it's really interesting kind of thinking about that. It's like the more exposure you had to the guy, you got more of his personality that you supposedly hated, not less. And that actually made you like the guy more. And a lot of it was just how original he was in the way that he conducted himself.
Well, and you mentioned his connection with it was outside of that. Like he appreciated, as I view it, he appreciated other people who had greatness. But you look at, he was great friends with Tony La Russa. Like during our class was when it was 98, because he was talking about the McGuire-Sosa home run battle. And he was talking about how he was talking to La Russa the night before, like about McGuire hitting. And he was friends with like D. Wayne Lucas, Bill Parcells. You know, he had connections in all sports. And he was but it's like, I think he just viewed that other greatness. You mentioned him coming back to Assembly Hall, which was huge. I'm very happy with the fact that, we talk about what Woodson has done as a former player, being coach, kind of embracing the past, bringing those players back. And if this had to happen, it feels right that it happens with Woodson at the helm than had it been like Crean or Archie. Not knocking them. It's just, it feels like, if there has to be an endpoint to the Bob Knight story, it does feel right that it happens while Woodson's at the helm. And, because this is going to be an emotional couple of weeks, months, like, under the wrong hand. Again, how the team deals with this as a whole, it's not anything that matters when you're talking about life or death. But it does feel, it feels right that Woodson is at the helm of this and is going to shepherd the IU basketball team dealing with this.
Yeah. Well, and look, a couple of things that people have brought up that I think are worth mentioning. Yeah. I mean, he created so many iconic moments for IU fans. I mean, someone mentioned the Jack, the Purdue fan thing on the coach's show, which, at a time when, the IU Purdue rivalry is different than the IU Kentucky rivalry. It's people who are here know what I'm talking about, but at the height of that rivalry, to bring out a donkey with a Purdue hat on a coach's show. I mean, just who would have thought to do that? But that was a Bob Knight thing. The fact that he was so present, like the number of commercials that are out there from Central Indiana. I almost posted one on the Twitter feed. It's him like selling Buicks. He's advertising for like Central Indiana Buick dealers, and he's throwing in a signed basketball if you buy like a new LeSabre from Dave Skillman or whatever.
Dude, his the golfing stuff, like just search Bob Knight golf. Like it's like some of those golf shows are just like, wow.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about him is he was very conscious that what he said and did was funny.
Yeah. It's like Pat Knight said in that piece. It's like, there was a plan with almost everything he did, whether it was getting, maybe it came back to haunt him with Ted Valentine, but it's like the whole whip thing that was to get the pressure off the team and get it onto him. Like, let's just get all the pressure onto me. A lot of the rest stuff was that, like, just make me the attention so the players can go play. It really, there was always a method to the madness. He wasn't just doing things to do things.
Yeah. And that it's what made Knight such a compelling figure, not just to fans, but also to writers and journalists. And, someone mentioned the Frank DeFord piece, The Rabbit Hunter, which really is a remarkable piece of sports journalism. But even the Dick Schaap piece that I posted earlier on the Crimson Cast.
Well, and you mentioned Season on the Brink. I mean, that was just one of the first books of its kind.
I mean, you have Friday Night Lights and you have Season on the Brink, and they're kind of two of a similar piece. It's like, here is an unflinching inside look at in Friday Night Lights, a high school town in Texas, and what football means, both the good and the ugly. And Season on the Brink, was an accident. It was one of those things where Knight just, I think, as a second thought, was like, yeah, sure,
whatever.
He says this writer's an okay dude. I'm going to let him watch all of our practices. And what, he's going to write something for the Sunday, variety section. No, he writes this whole thing about Knight, and the whole thing's about Knight. It's not about the team. I mean, the team gets mentioned, but it's a personality profile of someone that is just incredibly complex. And you would find yourself constantly trying to evaluate what Knight was doing, and he would always seem to be like a step or two ahead. And I think to some degree, this is where, his role within Indiana University becomes a fascinating one, because he was such a larger than life figure. And I think he certainly leaned on that to a large degree. And, having worked in academia for a long time, that engenders a lot of anger and jealousy. And look, Knight was certainly not a perfect coworker, was certainly not a perfect, citizen of the university. But he would
and sometimes I wonder,
he would offset that by doing all of these tremendous things. And this is again where it's just such a complicated legacy, but it is such a dominant legacy in terms of like, this is someone who, if you didn't like him, he gave you plenty of reasons not to like him. If you loved him, he gave you plenty of reasons to love him. And he didn't particularly seem to care one way or another. I never got a sense, the clever asides aside, the clever one-liners, you never got the sense Knight would do things specifically because he was trying to be popular. There's a period in the 1984-85 season where IU goes to Illinois and they bench all the starters. And, it's an important game. Indiana's struggling. He just benches all the starters, doesn't play them, plays all freshmen and Uwe Blab at center, and they lose the game, and people freak out. And Knight goes on his coach's show the next day and basically is like, you know what? Leave the coaching to me. I know what I'm doing. It's where, people forget, like the bury me upside down and my critics and kicks my ass. That was a direct response to benching all of his starters in the second half of a game at Minnesota in that 1994 season. And Indiana lost by 50, 106-56. It was Knight's largest loss at IU. And I can distinctly remember as a 13, 14-year-old, however old I was at the time, on the nightly news on, Channel 6, Ed Sorts is like, is Knight done? Should Knight be fired? Like stuff like that. And then they turn around, they win games down the stretch, and I think finished second in the conference that year. And that was what that was in response to. He would create things that would become cultural icons almost by accident. Ivan Renko is a great example. For those who don't know the story, like Knight in 1992-93, they had a team that was at or near the top of the polls for most of the season. So what does Knight do? In late January, I think it was, or mid-January, he gets asked a question either on his coach's show or in a press conference. I think it was his coach's show. And he says, well, instead of talking about the team, I want to talk about this kid that we're recruiting out of Yugoslavia. He's a 6'8" kid named Ivan Renko. And, he can do kind of anything with the basketball. He can shoot, he can dribble, he can drive. This kid's going to be maybe one of the best basketball players in college basketball when we get him in here next year. Now, there was no Ivan Renko, but for literally like a month, all you heard about was Ivan Renko. I remember, there were TV reports that people had seen like Ivan Renko get on a plane and fly to New York. A recruiting service claimed that they had scouted Ivan Renko and they rated him like a high 4-star prospect or something like that. Like, there was no Ivan Renko, but Knight did that to take pressure off of his team, and it worked. It was fascinating to watch the entire media world and fandom for IU kind of wrap around what Knight would do or say when he was at the height of his powers at Indiana. It's something I'll never forget.
Well, and that's, you mentioned, like, that's something you don't see, but it's like that Knight knew the power he had, and it's partially because he had so much success early, but he used it unlike very few coaches I've ever seen. Like, it's somebody who, it's like that, the best analogy I can think of is like if you're, valedictorian and you're 3 months before you're going to graduate high school, and it's like, you're going to get all A's. It's like, you're kind of, you're good, but you can kind of coast. And he had that, like, everything you're mentioning is kind of just a guy who's like, yeah, I could do this and say stuff. And you even see it today. It's like, after a couple titles, Roy Williams still would, kind of get defensive on the meet. It's like he's still doing the coaching thing. Like, I think the only person who maybe has that is like Belichick, but Belichick's not funny. Like Belichick is just like on, he knows he doesn't have to answer any questions. On to Cleveland, who cares? But he's not funny. Knight had the funny and doing that, but it was definitely I know I'm not going to get fired. Like, I know I'm probably the smartest guy out here. So it's like, whatever. You mentioned the IU. I've always wondered this because you and I've talked about this many, many times that, he was kind of playing with LSU. Like, he kind of, used his power to get more leverage against IU and kind of said I was going to leave or go to a different school and then use that to get more leverage. I've always wondered if like there's a part of where it's like, the dog that catches the car, like, by the 90s, he had almost gotten so much power at IU because he had the leverage that it ended up, causing him some issues of like having just too much overall power. But again, it's like, this is with Knight. Like when I would talk to other fans, over the years, and it's like, why couldn't he just, not get mad or not throw the chair? By the way, 50 minutes in, we haven't even mentioned the chair. Right. Why can't he not be mad or not throw the chair? My thing was always like, you don't get it's all together. Like you take that away, and I just don't think Knight doesn't stand. It's the four legs of a chair that hold it together. You can't just say, "Hey, be less angry" or "Don't do the antics," because, like we said, it wasn't like that was just, I'm screwing off and now I'm going to coach. Like, it was all part of that stew. But I've often wondered that like every time he had the leverage, he pushed IU to get more, to the point that, I mean, you when we went to school, it's like IU had an athletic department and had basketball. Like, basketball had its own colors, had its own logo. Like, basketball was a separate entity apart from athletics. And I do wonder if that didn't help him in the end.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a much longer show to be done on that. And it's an interesting question. It really is, because I think, I do think Knight, and this bears out, if you read Season on the Brink, like, Knight wins that title in 81 and he kind of gets bored and he kind of drifts off and he's like, I'm going to let the assistants do the recruiting. And a lot of Season on the Brink is him getting mad at the fact that they don't have, in his mind, the players that they need to compete. And then he recommits himself, and they win a national title in 87.
Which is such a wild thought to think, like, he kind of does, sorry to cut in, but it's like he kind of takes 2 years off, so to speak, and just kind of lets it coast. It doesn't work. But then it's like, he just turns it on. It's like, all right, like, the Season on the Brink was 85. Mm-hmm. They won the title in 87. It's like he starts doing JUCOs, like, Keith Smart's at JUCO. It's like he just taps into new stuff and, like, boom, turns it on. Yeah. And then, like, the Jay Edwards didn't quite work out, but it's like he kind of then it's like figures out 92, and then that's again the legacy, a totally different pod. It's like it felt like he was coasting when we were there, but it's like I felt like he was like, I'm going to turn it on one last time, and that was that team he coalesced in 02. But that's again the amazing part of Knight, is like, coaches can coast, but then when they try and turn it on, it's like suddenly, they don't have the same connections. But it's just like he in 18 months he has a national championship caliber team. Sorry.
No, it's right. And it's kind of the big question mark, because it's Knight was interested in coaching his way. And there were a lot of periods during his career where he could have gotten better players, better, more athletic players.
Dudes.
Sorry, as Chronic Hoosier and I talked about. I mean, there were a lot of moments like that. But Knight was very interested in coaching players that he wanted to coach. And if you read all the stuff on Knight, which I have, there was a real streak in him that was like, I want to do things my way, because his way had been proven to be so successful. That didn't mean that he wasn't willing to change what his way was, but once he changed what his way was, that became the new his way. And there was a rigidity to that, certainly I think Knight could have won more national titles, but as that Parrish thing pointed out, like, Knight will always be held, I think, by basketball people in much higher regard than John Wooden, because Knight won games without having a very demonstrable, bag man pulling in players. Knight will always be held in higher regard than Dean Smith, because even though Dean Smith was a very fine coach, Dean Smith, operated an NBA factory with all of the players that came and went with North Carolina. And you look at Knight and what he did at IU, and he won all those games and all those championships with one NBA All-Star, like multi-time All-Star or Hall of Famer in Isaiah Thomas. And he had Randy Whitman was an excellent NBA player. Mike Woodson was an excellent NBA. Ken Benson had a pretty long career, but the caliber of player that Knight wanted to coach was so different, and I think that IU fans identify with that as much as anything else, because Indiana as a state, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's an agrarian factory combo state. It's a state that doesn't have a lot of the advantages of being on one of the coasts. And, IU people and Indiana people, and especially people that have nothing to do with Indiana University. I think this is the population that gets forgotten about. The people who did not go to college, but IU was their team, and they followed that team, and they took a special pride in the ethic that IU under Knight carried, which was, we are going to take a group of players who aren't the most talented, who aren't the most physically gifted, who may be limited in certain aspects of their game, and we're still going to win at least 70-75% of our games. We're going to win a Big Ten title. We're going to compete for national titles. I mean, one of the kind of the favorite under the radar players for IU fans from this era was a guy in Brian Sloan who never shot the ball. Yeah. His whole purpose, he's out there screening for people. Became like Dick Vitale's watchword, is like Sloan 45. I mean, that was the fact that Knight was able to establish that kind of a mentality and that kind of an ethic and the emotional response among fans for those sides of things. It perfectly fit Indiana, the state of Indiana, in a way that it probably wouldn't have fit at another school or another state. I mean, it would have been hard to have seen him do this at, like a Texas or a Florida or a Wisconsin, where he actually accepted the job back in 1968 and then backed out of it. I mean, it is really interesting. Like, it was such a perfect marriage for almost 30 years. Not necessarily in terms of the university, because certainly things had fallen apart by the end there, but it was such a perfect marriage between coach and fan base. And again, not everybody, but the vast majority of the fan base, I don't think you could have picked a better coach, a coach that was more representative of how people wanted to root for a team than you could have with Knight in Indiana. And even in the lean years, you felt like Knight was just one player away or one result away from getting things turned around. And that's probably never going to get replicated ever again with IU. It's really hard to envision. And I guess, I don't want to go forever here. We're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I'll probably take that away from it more than anything else. Is like, here's the fact that you and me as people growing up, as fans, as students, as people who were in his class, got a chance to be a part of that for a lot of our early years. I'll always treasure that. I mean, one of the reasons I go back and digitize all the old tapes of those games and try to put them on YouTube, I want to try to preserve that in some way. And there was a time when Indiana University basketball wasn't just special. It really was the epicenter of college basketball, and Knight was the reason why. I don't know if he could have done it at another place in quite the same way. Don Fisher once, right after Knight was fired, was like, these two things did a lot for each other. And it's true. But we can certainly say in the 15 years prior to Knight getting to IU, and certainly for most of the 15 to 20 years since he left, IU is, it's been a struggle for IU. And it was certainly a struggle for Knight too. Knight went to Texas Tech, certainly didn't have the same level of success because that's a tough place to win. And Knight's magic was kind of inextricably linked to what he was able to do here at IU. And I just think that everybody tonight, if you think about anything with this, think about how special that was if you were a part of it. And if you're further down the line, if that legacy precedes you, it helped to build what Indiana basketball still is today, what it could be again. And I really do think that that's an important thing. And I think that every fan base that's had such an iconic figure in its midst for as long as Knight was here, I think that's something you can take with you and keep as part of the way that you think about that program, think about your relationship to the program. And that's certainly what I'll be thinking about tonight.
I'm not sure. Like, that was great. That was all. I mean, that was all very well said. I'm not sure. I echo all of that and agree. I mean, I feel lucky to have grown up in Bloomington during that era. You know, during that run of 87 to 93, when it wasn't the 70s and the undefeated seasons, but it's like it was still close enough. You heard that, and yeah, I echo everything you said. And it's a sad, it does hit you. It kind of hits your own mortality, because it's like that was the coach growing up, and there's family. It is so interwoven with me growing up, and I think everyone who's on this pod and listening and just a fan of IU. Most people have a Knight story or a Knight interaction, and you know, when I tell people I was in his class, I was like, I got to know some stories, and it's like I have stories. I have tons of stories. Like, and I think that's the thing is, you know, you can bump into famous people, or it's like, I've never met anybody who had an interaction with Knight that doesn't have a story. Yeah. Where it's like, oh yeah, I got my story, I got your, and it's whether it's a funny or bad, like there's a story to go with it. You know, I also just, it's, you know, apropos of nothing else, but I do wonder how, you know, how the university is going to honor him. You know, it's always been the joke, you know, Dick Vitale never starts saying, you know, they got to name the court after Bob Knight. It's like, all right, the court is named. Like, all IU fans know it's Branch McCracken Court.
McCracken is also very important.
Yeah, McCracken did something as well. But I do wonder, you know, what else can you name out there or do, you know, Knight's in the IU Hall of Fame. Doesn't need to be answered today, but that's the other thing I think of is like, you know, he, you know, if you were going to take McCracken's name off the court and move him somewhere else, it would be fitting to put Knight there. It'd be fitting to name Assembly Hall after Knight. It would be fitting to name the Athletic. I mean, yeah. I go back to I go back to that initial thought of he wasn't just Indiana University. As somebody from Indiana, he was Indiana. And, you know, when I grew up, the Colts were bad. The Colts weren't there. The Pacers were, as you said, kind of an afterthought. They were there, but they just weren't really that thought of, you know, up until 91 or 92, when the Colts started to have a little bit of success and the Pacers had Reggie Miller. Like, that entire run, the state was Notre Dame or Indiana, and for basketball, it was Indiana. And it was Bob Knight, and he was, when I would travel, it would be, oh, Bob Knight, like he throws a chair, and it's like, I'd hear that. We went to France, and I heard that. It's like, that was the state of Indiana. Yeah. So yeah, well, it's a sad night for everyone. It's conflicted, but in the end, I think you're right. It's like, it was special that we had that, and we had it at IU.
No, and look, I mean, all that's true, and it's going to take me a while still to process what I'm feeling, but you know, I'll say this: Knight and IU breaking up the way that they did was like, you know, watching your parents get divorced and then take shots at each other for, you know, 10 years. And so I'm just glad that, you know, there's still people who are going to point out things that they didn't like about Knight, things they didn't like about the way Knight interacted with IU. And I get all that. And I'm not saying those people are wrong. I'm just saying, for the people that really loved Knight and love Indiana, I'm glad that we don't have to have that as the backdrop. I'm glad that at least the reconciliation of these two institutions were the backdrop. And so, look, I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. We didn't want to go too long on this, but certainly was nice to be able to talk about some memories and watch everybody's comments coming in and hear your memories as well. We appreciate it, and we certainly appreciate Coach Knight. Our sympathies with, as we mentioned, his wife Karen and his sons Tim and Pat and his grandchildren and all of his extended family. So Bob Knight, dead at the age of 83. Well, we'll certainly have more coverage with this on the Back Home Network moving forward, but we really appreciate you folks taking the time to join us tonight. Scott, thank you for hopping on short notice. And we will chat about this again in the future. We hope you folks have a great rest of the evening. Go watch the remainder of the post-game podcast that Do the Work is doing right now on the women's game, as they had a big win tonight in their exhibition game. And both the women's team and the men's team, we've learned, are going to be wearing commemorative patches honoring Bob Knight on the jerseys throughout the course of the season. So happy to see that. Anyway, thanks everybody again. For Scott, I'm Galen. On behalf of Crimson Cast and the Back Home Network, we'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.